You know, there has been similar events to this, very similar, in fact. And I believe that the last time we had this type of dramatic rhetoric, they actually had it dead wrong. It sounded extremely familiar to what we just heard last week. This was just a few years ago.
It's the latest on the swine flu epidemic, which the CDC said today has spread widely and cannot be contained.
We do not think we can contain the spread of this virus.
The global threat level is now at its highest ever.
President Obama decided to declare the epidemic a national emergency of swine flu.
Medical workers in biohazard suits and people wearing surgical masks out on the streets.
Public events have been canceled and children are being turned away from their classrooms as schools nationwide have been shut down until May 6th.
Staff aren't taking any risks. And elsewhere, authorities are doing whatever they can to reduce the chance of more infection.
The Centers for Disease Control this past week quadrupled its estimated H1N1 flu virus death toll to roughly 3,900.
46 states are reporting H1N1 as widespread, with more than 1,000 deaths and 20,000 hospitalizations. And while an average case is usually no more dangerous than other flu, this strain has its unknowns. 30% of the deaths are in healthy people with no underlying problems.
We don't know how good or bad this situation is because we don't actually know how many people are infected.
Government officials struggling to cope with the outbreak have launched a massive public health campaign to get people to wear masks and wash their hands.
Even if it turns out that the H1N1 is relatively mild on the front end, it could come back in a more virulent form during the actual flu season.
Around the country, tens of thousands lined up for swine flu vaccines, hoping to get a shot before being shut out.
But there are only 11 million doses available, far short of the 40 million expected by this time, and the 150 million the government says will eventually be needed for everyone.
We don't know what the future will bring in terms of H1N1 cases.
The earlier we get the vaccines, the better.
Absolutely.
Crazy, isn't it? It's almost like the same script was borrowed. The movie didn't do well the first time, let's make a sequel, and here we are. I don't want to undermine what's happening here. We have been sticking to the numbers. I'm not going to project into things, but the similarity is striking. Only that time, they got it dead wrong. And many of us have forgotten that and that's what I want to remind you of. Remember the headlines that came out after the H1N1 pandemic crisis. Daily Mail said, "The false pandemic. Drug firms cashed in on scare over swine flu," claims Euro Health Chief. The health chief said the drug firms were the ones that had driven this. And then Boston.com had this to say. 2 medical reports accused WHO of exaggerating H1N1 threat. They went after the WHO that was behind it. Very much the WHO is a part of this pandemic scare we have right now. And then, of course, CBS News, Cheryl Atkinson was a top reporter who did a giant investigation into this. This was her article, "Swine Flu Cases Overestimated?" ? And it went on to say, if you've been diagnosed, probable, or presumed 2009 H1N1 or swine flu positive in recent months, you may be surprised to know this. Odds are you didn't have H1N1 flu. In fact, you probably didn't have flu at all. That's according to state-by-state test results obtained in a 3-month-long CBS News investigation. In late July, the CDC abruptly advised states to stop testing for H1N1 flu and stop counting individual cases. The rationale given for the CDC guidance to forego testing and tracking individual cases was, why waste resources testing for H1N1 flu when the government has already confirmed there's an epidemic? And so they had testing issues, and they were avoiding it. And she put out some very interesting graphs because they did look into testing. And look what they discovered in the different states like Florida, that, you know, negative for other flus. 83%, only 17% ended up having the H1N1 flu when they really looked at the studies. In California, only 2% ended up having H1N1 flu. And there was 12% that had others. Then the other 86% were having symptoms from something else. There's way too much assumption that had gone on. You look at Alaska, 1% H1N1. Georgia, 2%. This was a devastating report looking at the medical establishment. Really You had to also fault mainstream media for how hard it had pushed this issue. And then there was a brilliant article that came out in the BMJ. Let's take a look at this. In the BMJ, this was written. The world should, of course, be thankful that the 2009 influenza A H1N1 pandemic proved such a damp squib. With so many fewer lives lost than had been predicted, it almost seems ungrateful to carp about the cost. But carp we must, because the cost has been huge. Some countries, notably Poland, declined to join the panic buying of vaccines and antivirals triggered when the World Health Organization declared the pandemic a year ago this week. However, countries like France and the United Kingdom, who have stockpiled drugs and vaccines, are now busy unpicking vaccine contracts, selling unused vaccine to other countries, and sitting on huge piles of unused oseltamivir. Meanwhile, drug companies have banked vast profits, $7 billion, $10 billion from vaccines alone, according to investment bank J.P. Morgan. Given the scale of public costs and private profit, it would seem important to know that WHO's key decisions were free from commercial influence. The article goes on to show all the people that had been behind these decisions that weren't free from corporate interests, but in fact stood to make money or worked for drug makers and things like that. Now, is this happening again? We don't know. But I will tell you, I have had people close to me, others reach out and say, Del, you're in dangerous territory. You better be careful about challenging the numbers, challenging Tony Fauci. And, you know, and that made us really, really adamant. I was adamant with my team that we get this right. I told you last week, we don't want to mess up on the numbers. But I'm telling you right here on the Highwire, we do walk a high wire. We are not afraid to bring you the truth. And we have looked everywhere we can for the truth. We want to get this right. We don't want to sensationalize. I don't want to undermine, data that could end up showing that this illness is really deadly. But we also, I want you to wear the hat now and imagine we have gotten this wrong before. The same exact players were dead wrong before. And if they're wrong this time, it will be a lot more than buying way too many vaccines and making drug makers billions and billions of dollars. Now we are losing jobs, not just in this country, but around the world. Our livelihood, our futures are at stake. Our 401ks are at stake. Everything, the way we're going to raise our kids, are they going to be able to ever hug in the future? All of these things are hanging the balance. Is it possible we got it wrong? Is it possible that the media might be pushing it too far?